Hello, BookTube. This is Glenn here at Glenn's Bookshelf, and I wanted to try to take on the reading shifts tag, which I believe was created from Hannah at Hannah's Books, and from which I saw videos by Aaron Facer and Kelly at Books I'm Not Reading. So I am kind of responding to both of their videos. I will link to Hannah's original video as well as the two booktubers I just mentioned. This is, I think, a really fascinating tag. It has some pretty thoughtful questions. And again, like most of my videos, I haven't scripted this out, so I'm not, uh, I'm not completely sure how I want to respond to some of these questions. But I do think they are just sort of generally just a very fascinating topic, having to do with how our reading has shifted over time and kind of what do we think is, what are the factors kind of behind that. So the first question is, how has your reading developed over your lifetime? Do the kind of books that bring you the most pleasure now differ from the books you loved most earlier in your life? If you've seen big changes in your reading since you've matured, what might explain your changing interests? Well, I guess there's a couple different ways to think about this question. One would be looking at maybe childhood reading and comparing that to now, or comparing more young adult reading to my reading now. And I'm 59, so I've had plenty of time to kind of see a shift in my reading. I think there have been a couple shifts. One was just going from reading a lot of horror books, Stephen King, Peter Straub, books like that, in my teens and maybe early adulthood, that I don't read much of anymore. And I'll talk a little bit more uh, about my reading of horror books in one of the questions down below. So there have been a couple of shifts. I would say there was the shift away from mostly fiction, mostly horror books in my late teens and early 20s into reading a lot of nonfiction, mostly histories, particularly American histories, biographies, a lot of current event books. So a lot of nonfiction that I read throughout my 30s and 40s, and I continued to read fiction during those years, but fiction became a much less important part of my reading regimen. And there may have been a few reasons for that, but I think kind of the main reason was just as I got into my early adulthood, I just became much more politically aware and socially in tune to political developments, social developments, things going on in the world, and that those kinds of questions and issues sort of overtook my just the way I thought about the world and looked at the world. And so I read, really dived into a lot of nonfiction, developed a love of history that I think had been there in my childhood, but really kind of came to the fore as in my early to early mid adult years. But along with that, there was a lot of my reading had a very I think sort of behind it was felt a need to get information, to know things, to have facts. And I think at least some of my reading was of a more, particularly like the current events reading, and a lot of the religious reading I was also doing during these years was of a sort of a more contentious character. The idea, just the feeling that I needed information in order to sort of compete in the emerging world of opinions and social media, and having a sense of knowing what I was talking about and being able to defend a position or advocate for a position. And so I mean, a lot of the reading I was doing during these years was enjoyable and informative, but I think there was also behind it, the context of it, the world that I was living in was, I think, just a more combative, contentious world. And so I wanted to be armed for that, for lack of a better explanation. And I think what's happened in the last 10 years or so is I really have gotten away from reading biographies and big histories and the big sort of chunker books that I used to gravitate to. Have gotten away from reading current events. I have gotten away from reading more polemical books about religion or politics, and my reading has shifted to a more just more pleasure reading, more comfort reading. The religious material that I tend to read these days is much more of I would say more of a contemplative, kind of open-ended spirituality, as opposed to books about doctrine. And my nonfiction reading has sort of gravitated more towards psychology, personal growth, books of that nature. I did a video a few days ago about sort of psychological memoirs. So my reading has shifted in the nonfiction realm. It has shifted from kind of big histories and biographies to kind of smaller volumes on spiritual contemplation, and psychology, books, mental health, books that I think are generally kind of less contentious and more, I think, thoughtful and more reflective. And at the same time, I think my reading has shifted away from nonfiction kind of back to fiction. So that's kind of an interesting turn of events, sort of in a way kind of returning a bit to more of my childhood in finding comfort in certain types of fiction, and just kind of finding some escape and adventure in fiction books again. And I have gravitated a bit more towards reading some classical literature, and this year, especially the last few months, I have dived into some Victorian literature, thanks in part due to BookTube and Victober. And so I think there have been some real significant shifts in my reading over the last several years that I think are pretty positive. So generally, I think I'm pretty happy to see the shifts in my reading, and I think it reflects. I like to think it reflects a growing maturity and just a shift in my purpose of reading in terms of feeling like I need facts or arguments to reading things that I just think are just pleasure reads, or that are just sort of more uplifting and more edifying. And so I think that kind of sums up my reading shifts over the last couple decades. Question 2: do you find yourself choosing different kinds of books at different periods of the year? For example, do the seasons affect what you read for pleasure? Similarly, might you read very different kinds of books while on vacation? I'd say the simple answer to this question is no. I don't think my reading is very seasonal, except for the month of October, when I do find myself getting back into the spooky books and reading more of the horror books, and sort of getting into there's just a very kind of unique atmosphere in October, the change of seasons, the shortening of the days that just lend themselves to reading a certain kind of fiction. And then kind of when the month is over, I just sort of drop those books. So I think that's the most prominent example I can think of. But other than that, I don't think there's a real seasonal quality to my reading. That I think also October with Victober does present kind of an inspiration to read more Victorian literature, but I think I'm going to continue to do that anyway. So in general, no, not really much of a seasonal reader, except for the urge to pick up horror books, spooky books, during the month of October. Let's see, question number 3. Do specific experiences in your life ever shape what you choose to read? For example, did you read obsessively about child rearing when your kids were little, about gardening as spring is about to begin, about the experience of grief when someone you love died, etc.? And no, I can't really say that my book reading has ever shifted significantly based on changes in my life circumstances. None of the particular examples that were mentioned in the question really fit me, and I can't really say that any of my reading has been particularly event oriented in terms of personal events in my life. Although again, I think there was a period where, as I mentioned earlier, I read a lot of nonfiction that was very much in tune with current events, and so to that extent, I think my reading reflected what was going on in the outside world, and what was going on in the outside world that was events that were well known. So in general, no, I don't think my reading has been particularly overly personal or event focused, but my reading does tend to reflect shifts in the wider world, and sometimes I respond to changes in the world through seeking out different kinds of books. But I think more lately my reading has been much more of an internal quality, as opposed to anything going on in my life directly, or outside events or anything like that. Let's see. Question 4 is kind of closely, I think, related to question 3. Have there been any times in your life when circumstances have limited or changed your reading in some way? Perhaps caretaking responsibilities or a big move that made it hard to find as much time to read as you'd like, or personal illness that made it harder to concentrate, or maybe just long-term travel that might have limited your book choices. How do you deal with those circumstances? The only thing I can really think of is, for many years, I commuted kind of long distance to work. And by that I mean, I was commuting over an hour each way to work for more than 20 years, 21 years, I guess. And I think the result of that was to cause me to read more books using my e-reader, which was and is a Kindle. And so that, particularly, there were years where I was taking a bus into work, so I was on the bus almost the entire commuting time, and that really lent itself to the e-reader or the Audible versions of the books. And so I think that's one example. And now that I don't commute to work anymore, that has kind of gotten me away from the e-reader and from the Kindle. And I think the Kindle, the e-readers have some really important qualities. Being able to download a sample of a book before going out to buy it, I think that's really helpful. I think being able to change the font size, as my eyes have it's just gotten a little more uncomfortable. It's less pleasurable to read books with smaller print. So if I can enlarge the print, that's a good reason to have the e-reader. And kind of while I'm on the subject of e-reader and Kindle in particular, I've been thinking, I do think there's some good qualities of having the e-reader, but I just don't really seem to gravitate towards it. And I'm starting to think that maybe the reason is I have had a couple versions of the Kindle. There was what I think was probably the initial Kindle that was pretty basic. There was no backlighting to it. It just really didn't have a lot of features. Then there was the second iteration of the Kindle I got that I think was pretty nice, and it did have the backlighting, and it was kind of easy to kind of hold on to. But then I got myself, I thought that, well, the next stage in the evolution of Kindle was the Kindle Fire, and which offered lots of other, you could browse the internet and download audiobooks and things of that nature. And so probably about a year or two ago, I got a new Kindle. My previous Kindle Fire had become just almost unusable. But again, I'm finding that I don't really use it that much. And I'm thinking, that second version, excuse me, of the Kindle that I got was actually still a fairly nice Kindle. And it's a little smaller, a little easier to hold on to. And I'm thinking that maybe I might kind of go back to trying that older Kindle again. And that's not really directly related to this question, but it did get me thinking about e-readers and the value of them and how I might want to take advantage of them. So let's see what the next question is. The next two questions have to do with reading slumps and book hangovers, and this is kind of a fun topic. Question 5 is BookTube is full of discussions of reading slumps when dedicated readers seem to lose interest for a while in books. Sometimes they just can't find a book that appeals to them. Have you experienced a slump? If so, how did you handle it? If not, do you have any advice to give people who are experiencing slumps? And question 6 is booktubers also talk about book hangovers when readers are so moved by a book that they find it difficult to move on to a new book. Have you ever felt this way? I think these are kind of related questions. I don't think I've ever really experienced anything like a major or even minor reading slump. Excuse me while I drink something to kind of wet my whistle. I think I've been a pretty consistent reader, and I can't really think of any periods of time where I had a real reading slump or any that I noticed. But I do think the issue of reading slumps can sort of dovetail with the idea of a book hangover, and having read something that just left me just really feeling impacted and affected and just not kind of, where do I go from here? And I think there are kind of a couple examples from this year and I think this idea of sort of a book hangover is, like many things, something that kind of lies on a continuum. I think there are a couple of books that really impacted me when I read them this year. 2 that I will just briefly mention. One was, and I always get the title confused, it's a book by Liz Moore, The World as We Know It, or something like that, that has to do with the story of a girl who becomes a woman, and her experiences with her father, who experiences dementia, and she goes, there's a period where she's taking care of him, but there's it's also a book that focuses on changing technology and has a considerable time element to it. And it was a book that I kind of picked up and put down a couple of times during the summer, and then kind of the last third of the book just kind of really sort of swept me away, and the ending I didn't really see coming, and it just really kind of hit me pretty powerfully. And so that just really kind of rocked me for a bit. I was just, it was so, the ending was just sort of so powerful that, I just was kind of really wowed, and I really wasn't sure where to turn to read next. Somewhat a similar example was during Victober I read Anne Bronte's The Tenant of Wildfeld Hall, and just thought that was really just a really remarkable book. I've done a video on that earlier, and just the ending of it just left me really feeling significantly impacted, like I had read something significant in the world of literature. And I think maybe the common denominator of both books was an element of time and place and atmosphere, and the sense of just being kind of made a part of the story, and just feeling very attached to these characters and their lives and how they ended up. I think to a lesser extent, I've read a few fiction books, a few spy novels, read a couple of John le Carre books. in the last few weeks that I thought were really, really good. And that just sort of left me like, wow, these were really good. What's next? I'm not sure what I want to read next. And I think in general, the question of reading slumps or book hangovers, kind of my go-to device is comfort reads. There are particular authors that or subjects that I find myself sort of drawn to when I don't know what to read. This kind of in the last few weeks, I picked up one of the biographies of Abraham Lincoln was written by Doris Kearns Goodwin, a sort of famous American historian and biographer, and it's a book that is sort of it's mostly about Abraham Lincoln, but I think it's called Team of Rivals. It offers not only the story of Abraham Lincoln, but the stories of each of his rivals for the 1860 presidential nomination, Salmon Chase and William Seward and Edward Bates, and kind of puts Abraham Lincoln in the context of these different famous in their own rights competitors for the Republican nomination that year, and along with the obviously emerging issues that would lead to the outbreak of civil war in the United States in 1861. So Abraham Lincoln as a subject is always a kind of a comfort read for me. I've got a small bookshelf full of Abraham Lincoln biographies and books that address some element of Abraham Lincoln's personality or life. On the fiction side, I've gotten to be a big fan of the novels of Robert Harris, who writes a lot of historical fiction. And so I think if I'm in a reading slump or a reading hangover, I will reach for a reread of a Robert Harris book. I think any other advice I would offer people, if you're in a reading slump, just go to a bookstore and browse around. I mean, there's going to be something that's going to likely to trigger your fancy. So, but anyway, I really, really appreciate the question. Number 7, tell us about a few books that almost always work for you, something that might have remained a favorite throughout your life despite any changing reading taste, something that always seems to hit just the right spot when you need a lift, or perhaps some lifetime book hangover where the text will always be at the back of your mind. I think I've talked a little bit, I've just mentioned a couple subjects and writers that, kind of address those kinds of circumstances, those types of books that are just, that they sort of hold up over time, that they're, they always manage to, they're a book for any situation or any circumstance in life. I think the only addition I would make to that group is there is a Christian, I would call him a Christian contemplative writer by the name of Henry Nouwen, who was he was a Dutch man. He was a Catholic, a Roman Catholic, but he taught for many years at Yale and at Harvard, and he was an ordained priest, a theologian of significant stature, and wrote a number of books. And he, towards the end of his life, he went to he dropped out of academia more or less altogether, and took up residence in a series of homes for severely disabled, mentally and physically disabled people, and he became an assistant at one of these homes. And he's written a number of books about different spiritual topics, and there are a few books of Henry Nouwen's that are just, that I think have held up over time and that are always a constant resource for me. One is, I wrote a book on the parable of the prodigal son, called The Return of the Return of the Prodigal, I should say. I think that's a great book, even if maybe you're not, if Christian or religious reading is not a part of your repertoire. He also wrote a book as he was transitioning away from academia to this work in helping, in working with and living with disabled people. I think the name of the book is A Journey Home, or the journey towards home. And I find myself just sort of rereading that book a lot. It is kind of written in a diary fashion, and it's just, for me, it has held up over several years. Kind of maybe on the sort of diametrically opposed end of the spectrum for me in the world of fiction, the book 1984 has just held up pretty well over time. I think I first read that when I was a young adult, and I have reread it numerous times. And so I just think that book has just had a certain kind of staying power and longevity, and it just has never quite run out of style. It just never really feels old. And it always seems like the circumstances of that book could very readily come to pass. And I think especially now, with events in my own country, it's just a very apt piece of writing. And let's see, finally, number 8 is tag people. So I don't know if I'm going to tag anyone, or if I do, who I will tag. I'll have to think about that. But if you're watching this video and you haven't felt tagged or haven't been tagged, please consider yourself tagged. I would love to watch and listen to your response to your reading shifts, and what has changed for you over time in how you approach books and the substance and content of what you read. So thanks again for Hannah at Hannah's Books for coming up with this book tag, and I thank Kelly at Books I'm Not Reading and Aaron Facer at his channel for doing videos on the reading shifts tag, and I enjoyed those very much, and they inspired me to do my own video. So thank you for following along at almost 34 minutes here, by far my longest video. Hope it hasn't taxed anyone too much, but thank you for watching, and I look forward to doing another video and seeing you all again soon. So thanks for watching. Bye-bye.